Renegade result. The United States federal government should adopt a carbon tax. We observe that the specifics of a carbon tax we are debating today will be determined by the solution most likely reached of a carbon tax already passed by Congress and signed into law by the President in the real-world political climate. First, economic harms. Subpoint A, higher energy prices. Because 85% of our country's energy comes from hydrocarbons, a carbon tax logically leads to more expensive energy. Fossil fuel companies will pass on the cost of the tax to consumers through higher priced goods and services across the entire economy. Indeed, energy prices rose 110% when a carbon tax was passed in Australia, leading to over 100,000 layoffs and 10,000 business bankruptcies in the tax's first year, according to the Australian. If the same happened in America, higher energy prices alone would push 9.2 million Americans into poverty, according to government figures from the U.S. Senate. Moreover, even accounting for growth in the green energy sector, the Heritage Foundation estimates that a U.S. carbon tax would kill 1 million American jobs, and, to a greater extent, one popular carbon tax proposal would lead to $21 trillion in revenue losses every single year, according to modeling from Yale University professor William Nordhaus. Subpoint B is inequality. Professor Quals out of Stanford explains that the poor spend proportionally more of their income than the wealthy do on physical goods, which would be made more expensive by a carbon tax, goods such as food, gas, and heating. As a result, the National Bureau of Economic Research finds that a carbon tax burdens the poor 6 times as much as it does to the rich. Furthermore, a Tax Policy Center report finds that one of the most likely carbon tax proposals would cut corporate taxes, such that the wealthiest 20% would receive tax cuts, while the poorest 20% would actually see their tax rates increase by 1.5%. Increasing poverty and inequality will be the most important impacts in today's debate. The World Health Organization explains that poverty causes 80 times as many deaths as global warming. And Columbia University found in 2000 that 36% of all U.S. deaths can be attributed directly to poverty. More specifically, Forbes reports that higher energy costs in the United Kingdom have already led to 24,000 excess deaths every year due to the cold and lack of heating. And Dr. Inder Jatlani finds that there are 159,000 cold-related deaths every year in the United States. Increasing energy prices would only push Americans into poverty and add to the already horrific 875,000 Americans' lives lost who die from poverty each and every single year. Second, environmental harms. Subpoint A, increasing emissions abroad. MIT professor Mustafa Babakar explained in 2005 that when a nation unilaterally taxes carbon and thus imposes costs on businesses, companies and jobs simply move towards countries where carbon is not taxed. Demand slumps for the businesses which remain as consumers purchase cheaper goods produced in countries without a carbon tax. However, these countries without carbon taxes are also more likely to have lax environmental regulations in the first place. And thus, by pushing companies abroad and increasing demand for foreign goods, a U.S. carbon tax would ultimately only increase carbon emissions. This theory is born by Babakar's data, where he found that even if every developed country priced carbon, for every 1 million tons of carbon cut by taxing nations, 1.3 million more tons of carbon would be emitted by nations without carbon pricing, such as the 2 largest polluters, China and India, 2 countries who have even both promised to never tax carbon, according to the India Times. Subpoint B is natural gas. As the Wall Street Journal points out in November of 2015, large natural gas companies have actually lobbied in favor of a carbon tax because it will encourage companies to burn natural gas, which has a significantly lower carbon content than coal. Indeed, while many carbon tax supporters argue that a tax would support renewable energy, a survey of more than 20 experts concluded that the abundance of natural gas in the United States would actually delay the switch to renewable energy for decades. But while natural gas does emit less carbon, it leaks methane. And Stanford researchers estimate that because methane is 105 times worse in the environment, if you switch from coal to natural gas, you actually increase emissions by 5%. Thus, making.
Alright, we'll take running from Oh, wait. Before we start, do you see the $21 trillion loss?
Yep.
I'll just start with that.
Actually, one more. 1 million jobs lost accounted for green energy.
Yeah, we'll start with And can we just flip to one of the other parts that I just want to see right now, the 9.2 million of funds? You don't have the 9.2 million.
No, we just talked about energy contributions in Australia.
That was 47.
I'm Amador. So everyone, Anshul and I affirm today's topic resolved. The United States federal government should adopt a carbon tax. The most important factor in today's debate round is the well-being of United States citizens. We observe that because of the broadness of the resolution and the phrasing of carbon tax, the affirmative gets to define the specific carbon tax it is defending. The carbon tax we are proposing is revenue neutral, a model that is currently being followed around the world. A revenue neutral tax takes all profits made by the tax and funnels them back into the economy as tax refunds and lower tax rates. Contention 1 is empirical successes. There have been dozens of successful revenue neutral carbon taxes around the world, but for this debate, we'll be focusing on 4. We'll start with Finland. The Finnish government determined that because of the carbon tax, CO2 emissions were reduced by roughly 4 million metric tons, or 7%. But second, let's look to British Columbia. Per person consumption of fuels, there dropped by 16%. And since it was first introduced in 2008, the carbon tax has returned $500 million more to taxpayers in tax reductions than it has in raised revenue. In fact, the first 2 personal tax income brackets were reduced by 5%. The third is Sweden. The Swedish Ministry of Environment estimated that CO2 emissions fell about 15% because of the tax. In 2008, the revenues from CO2 tax were approximately $905 million. But fourth and most importantly is Norway. Emissions per unit of production in Norway were 22% lower after a carbon tax. Norway directs carbon tax revenues to general government accounts. With this revenue, Norway has financed a special pension fund that contains $373 billion, or nearly $80,000 for every single Norwegian. As we can see, carbon taxes have been a resounding success in nearly every developed country that has implemented them. Contention 2 is the redistribution of wealth. Even more importantly, tax reductions for consumers have important economic benefits. When taxes are lower, consumers have more money in their pockets to spend in the economy. The Guardian did an analysis of what a carbon tax would do around the United States and found 3 key impacts. The first, almost all regions experience a positive impact to job creation. The carbon tax tends to generate jobs in labor-intensive industries like healthcare and retail, which results in 2.1 million new jobs by 2025 and 2.8 million jobs by 2035. But the second impact is GDP growth. The Guardian also concludes that overall, the national GDP increases by $80 to $90 billion annually, with a cumulative increase of $1.3 trillion over the next 10 years. But third, per capita household income increases. The rebates return nearly $400 billion to households, or almost $300 per month for a family of 4. And the carbon tax aids in retirement of coal plants and accelerates investments in wind, solar, and nuclear power. Real per capita income is $500 more by 2025 and almost $800 more by 2035. Contention 3 is green energy. According to Eduardo Porter of the New York Times, a carbon tax is the most effective way to encourage investment in green energy. Steffi Fried from UCSD finds that by 2030, a carbon tax will cause green innovation to be 50% higher and fossil innovation to be 60% lower than it would have been without the tax. she finds that the price of green energy will decrease 17% in total. This is important because according to Dan and Nuccitelli of The Guardian, while fossil fuel costs increase with the carbon tax, energy expenditure for the consumer actually decreases in the long term with the rise of low carbon technology. There are 3 impacts. The first is jobs. According to Jacob Willian of business.com, a switch from one fossil fuel job to one green energy job creates 3 to 4 additional unrelated jobs because renewable energy is more labor intensive. But second, you see an increased revenue for investment with small businesses. UCS analysis found that the tax will allow $263 billion in new capital investment for renewable energy technologies, $13 billion in new landowner income biomass production, and $11 billion in new property tax. But third, we save lives. The Guardian finds that with CO2 emissions dropping by 52% over the next 20 years, we can save a cumulative 227,000 American lives from death by climate change. And for those reasons, I strongly urge an affirmative.
Okay, yeah. So could we see the card about the jobs gained through green energy? And the last card you just talked about. The last second. And then also if you could just pass it taking prep time while we're doing that. Jobs first sentence.
No, we're going crossfire right now.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, perfect. Since I spoke first, could I have the first question? Thank you. So, in your framework, you argued for a revenue-neutral carbon tax. So essentially, the money that people spend in a carbon tax will be given back to them. That is correct, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so under that logic, if people pollute and they get that money back from the carbon tax, what's the incentive to cut pollution if they're only going to get that money back?
The key distinction you have to make is between corporations and people, right? A carbon tax on corporations like energy companies, that they don't get their money back. But you guys argue that when you tax corporations, then the cost gets driven down to the people. That's true, right? But we're telling you that that cost is entirely offset by a revenue-neutral tax because the trillions of dollars you get from the tax is funneled back to the people. So corporations have a higher tax for energy. That's completely true. But the people, the cost to them doesn't really matter because that's offset by a revenue-neutral tax. But even more importantly, because there is a cost on the corporations, that drives them to innovate in green energy, which shows you a host of impacts that we read in our second argument. Okay, so can I have a question for you?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so in your second argument, you talk about natural gas, right?
Yep.
All right, so why can't a carbon tax be attached to methane?
So look at the definition of a carbon tax. It's a tax on the carbon content of fuels.
All right,
We
so-
agree, wait, can I finish my
Yeah,
answer?
sure.
We all agree that natural gas is composed of carbon, right?
Yes.
So, right now, it has less carbon content than coal. It will be taxed less. The danger is not the CO2 emitted by natural gas, but by the methane.
Okay, so
What we
you're
point
saying-
to you in Stanford is
So
105
you're saying
times
that
more.
natural gas is still going to be taxed under a carbon tax, right?
We're
Just at a
tell-
lower rate.
We're telling you that it's still going to be much cheaper than coal.
All right, so let me ask you a question. As of 2016, solar and wind energy are more cost effective than natural gas for companies already. So if you add more cost to natural gas, why are companies going to switch to natural gas if solar and wind are more
Wait,
cost
there's a
effective?
big problem with that. You said that renewable energy is more cost effective. So why is natural gas still the predominant use of energy across the entire
Because it's
world?
subsidized right now.
And renewable energy isn't under the status quo.
Not at-
Renewable energy
Not
is
at the
also
same level as
subsidized.
fossil fuels are subsidized. I think you could agree with
No,
that.
solar energy and wind energy are much more heavily subsidized.
That
The
is
government-
completely false.
No,
Wait,
let's
we're talking about the
explain-
United States, right? I know in
I'm
Europe
talking
that
about the
might
United
be
States.
different.
No, I'm talking about the United States.
All right, so
No,
what's
let's-
the rate of subsidies on green technology?
Let's take a look at it logically. Right now, renewable energy is much more expensive than coal and natural gas.
Okay,
I'm
just telling you a study by Forbes last month tells you that solar and wind are just as cost effective as fossil fuels like natural gas.
And we can also give you studies also by other articles that show you that because natural gas is still cheaper than solar, wind, geothermal in the United States, maybe not in Europe, but most certainly in the United States.
Alright, I would like that piece of evidence, by the way.
Great. But no, let me explain the logic behind it. Right now, we all know renewable energy is more expensive. The federal government knows
That's not
this.
true.
That's why they subsidize it more to make it more cost effective. But the problem is it's still not cost effective. Because when you're taking a look at prices, Americans still rely on natural gas. They still rely on coal.
Can we see that evidence?
Sure.
Did you guys have an idea? We did gas is similar price. Yeah. So again, while we're doing evidence exchange, unless you're going to be running prep, could you just not be doing prep?
It's in bold underlined.
Or you can I use this while you're giving your
Yeah,
speech?
for sure. I'll be starting with the hardware. That was 1 minute 30 seconds. And are you done with the card now, or are you still with it?
Oh, yeah.
Let's start with their framework, where they say they can define the carbon tax as a, quote, revenue-neutral carbon tax. This is inherently problematic for a few reasons. First of all, this is public forum debate. There are no plans on either side of this. We have to debate the resolution that was given to us, up on the board there, a carbon tax, exactly how it would be implemented in the real world, which leads to the second response, which is that the Tax Policy Center says that the most likely carbon tax to be implemented in the United States, Don't let them point to other countries like Finland, Norway, Sweden, British Columbia, where they're much more liberal than we are over here, is going to be one that's not revenue neutral, giving money back to individuals and poor families, but instead is going to cut the corporate tax rate, thus increasing taxes on the poor and decreasing taxes on the wealthy. That's what's going to happen in the real world, because Republicans aren't going to be willing not only to fund clean energy with this revenue, but also redistribute income. That's simply not going to happen in the real world. So let's talk about their first point, which is about empirical successes. Now, there are a few responses. First, Finland, Sweden, and Norway are all notorious for the historical reliance on renewable energy, whereas the United States has the largest natural gas reserves in the world. That may explain why they were able to cut emissions, but while the United States can't, because we will be able to shift to natural gas. Furthermore, in Norway, in Finland, Sweden, and Norway, they all have carbon taxes ranging from $50 to $118 per metric ton of carbon. Unfortunately, again, when we look to the real world, the highest estimates of a carbon tax in America would only be about $20 per metric ton. So we're not going to see anywhere close to these benefits for cutting emissions that we see in these countries, because again, it's politically infeasible. But second, let's talk about British Columbia. The Institute for Energy Research said that while domestic emissions in British Columbia did decrease, the problem with leakage that we point to in our case happened there. What they found is that cross-border border crossing between British Columbia and the United States, as well as neighboring Ontario, increased 136% after the carbon tax, because consumers were savvy. They knew that they could get cheaper gas in other states, and not say just drove there to get their gas. And that's exactly what's going to happen in the United States. Mexico doesn't institute a carbon tax. If other areas of Canada don't institute a carbon tax, there's going to be leakage, and we're not actually going to see a reduction in emissions. In fact, as we point to in our case, we're going to see a net increase in emissions. In fact, the EU, after they instituted a carbon tax, even though, again, they decreased their emissions abroad, because a lot of their companies went overseas, because a lot of their individuals in their countries were purchasing things from abroad, overall emissions increased 12%. But third, these are all, again, revenue-neutral carbon taxes, which isn't going to happen in America and isn't relevant to this round. And fourth, let's talk about empirical failures. In Australia, remember where we point to in our case, not only did it cut 100,000 jobs, not only did 10,000 companies fail, but it was also repealed primarily because it destroyed the Australian economy. That's the most high-profile example of a carbon tax and the one most similar to the United States, and that's the precedent we should be looking to in today's debate. But next, they talk about redistribution of wealth, and again, there are a couple of responses. First, it's also based off a revenue-neutral carbon tax. And remember, they can't talk about this. They can't simply say, well, we're the affirmation, and we decide that we're just going to magically give all this money to poor people. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. We're not going to see a redistribution of income. But second, look to one of our most important impacts in today's debate, that with one of the most popular forms of a carbon tax proposed, we would actually hurt the economy by $21 trillion. And the logic here is simple. We're increasing energy prices. We're making goods and services across the country more expensive, because we're not going to be able to switch to renewables, and as a result, we're going to see economic harms. But third, they talk about green energy, and the problem is their impact with this. More jobs and this saving lives are all from an article entitled How a Revenue-Neutral Carbon Tax Creates Jobs. Again, this is the problem with their argument. It all relies on a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Remember also where we point to in our case, natural gas is cheaper than these renewables. Their card, I've read it before. We even have it on the affirmation. It says in some markets it's cheaper, but overall natural gas is still cheaper. Thus, we're going to see a shift to natural gas, not these renewables.
Okay. We'll take a look at it. My opponents say we need to defend spend what is most likely to be taxed. That's not true given the wording of the resolution. It asks what the United States should do, not what the United States can do. Should implies ought and moral responsibility. The United States should adopt a revenue neutral tax if that brings the most benefits. But even aside from that, most of the carbon taxes are revenue neutral in the world. That's why we're showing you that the most likely carbon tax the United States would enforce is a revenue neutral carbon tax. But even besides that, they say the most likely thing would be $20 per ton of carbon dioxide. The Congressional Budget Office studied a proposed carbon tax of $20 per ton of carbon dioxide, and they say that the United States government would increase revenue by $1.2 trillion and emissions of carbon dioxide would decrease by 8%. That's satisfying both sides. But now let's go to their first argument about economic harm. Against subpoint A, we have 3 responses. First, look to the very beginning of our third argument, which we tell you that because the green energy prices drop by 17%, consumers in the long run have to spend less on energy. This is critical because we're showing you a long-term impact in the benefit of the citizens' economic standing. But second, remember there's a 70% drop for green energy, and there's a 50% of money goes into this green energy in the future. Now this is critical because for every job that we create in the green energy sector, 3 to 4 additional indirect jobs are created. So not only do we move away from fossil fuel industry, we create more jobs in a better area. Now the third response is that a lot of their evidence in this subway is simply illegitimate. First, they say $21 trillion loss in growth in the United States. Their evidence talks nothing about the United States. It talks about a carbon tax implemented around the world. It has nothing about the impact specifically to the United States. But then they say 9.2 million people will go into poverty. Again, they just don't have that number anywhere when I ask for it. They just say because prices would increase in Australia, that would happen here, and that would cause 9.2 million people. Their evidence says nothing about that. You can look at it after the round. Now go to their subpoint B where they talk about inequality. 3 main responses here. First, remember at the bottom of our second contention, Ani tells you that the income will increase by $800 for the lowest 2 income groups. But not only that, in Norway, where they implemented a revenue neutral tax, $80,000 was given to every Norwegian because they had enough money to create a new pension system. This is critical because we're specifically showing you the benefit that it would have to the lower income people. But second, again, we're increasing the job creations. In fact, the Guardian said that there will be 3 million jobs that are created by the end of 2030. Again, one job created in the green energy sector creates 3 to 4 indirect jobs. That's going to be a key reason you're going to be voting for us. But third, and most importantly, we are saving American lives at the end of this debate. We specifically show you that a 52% decrease in carbon emissions is what is going to happen with the proposed carbon tax. And this will save 13,000 American lives every year, and in the next 20 years, it'll save 230,000 American lives. Now go to their second argument about environmental harms. Subpoint A, they talk about leakage. First, you turn this argument against them because on net, it is still a decrease. In fact, the actual carbon leakage worldwide average is only 5 to 20%. So if it goes down by 100% in certain countries, it only increases 5 to 20%, which is still a net decrease of carbon emissions. But moreover, 82% of economists agree that if the United States did a carbon pricing plan, such as carbon tax, then other countries would follow suit. So this means that companies can just go to another nearby country because that new nearby country is now going to adopt a carbon tax or a similar policy just like what the United States did. So you can solve that problem by voting for the affirmative. But next, they talk about natural gas. Remember, methane is CH4. It has carbon in it. It would still be taxed. And then, more importantly, their evidence about what they were talking about in cross-examination is from March of 2006. We give you evidence from just last month that tells you solar and wind energy are going to be 5% less expensive, so they will invest in that. Moreover, look to the projection of the long term, in which we tell you that by 2030, there will be a 60% decrease in fossil fuel use and a 50% increase in green energy use. We are showing you what is happening now and what will happen in the future, showing you that we will save money, save lives for the American citizens. Thank you.
Ready?
Yeah. You can go ahead and ask that question.
So seeing as these methane leaks from natural gas are popping up in different wells and different pipelines across the country, how exactly is the United States going to measure and tax every single one of these leaks?
Okay, look, you don't have to measure and tax every single one of these leaks, but if methane is under just a general carbon tax, you're still seeing, like, on net, like, on average, the price of methane is going to go up.
Well, no,
and
see,
insofar as we told you that solar and wind energy are going to be $6 less, Like, I don't see why this is still a debate anymore.
The reason why it's still in debate is because we admit you can tax when you're exporting steel, when you're exporting oil, because you can measure how much carbon went into the production of those goods. Can I please finish my point? The production of those goods, or the amount of carbon that will be emitted by that oil. Unfortunately, you can't do the same for natural gas because there are some emitters who have a lot of methane leaking out of their pipes, and a lot of emitters who have none. So the U.S. government will never be able to find where and when these leakages are and how.
There's going to be leakage and stuff. Like there's going to be some leakage of methane, right? But like that's a very small fraction. You guys aren't even giving the amount. Like
no,
I don't even know that exists.
No, we do.
But
we show you in our case. The authors of the study look at both the decreases in carbon emissions if we switch away from coal,
and the overall average.
Can I please finish? I was trying to answer your question. As well as the increases in emission due to methane, they find that on net there's a 5% increase in emission because methane is 105 times worse. I mean, you can look at the card. It's 105 times worse for the environment.
Okay, so you're deriving the 105 times worse meaning leakage. 105 times worse has nothing to do with leakage, right? Those are two completely different arguments.
I mean, I'm talking about methane leakage, not.
Yeah,
it's just
sure, but that's not what your evidence is talking about. It's talking about trapping carbon dioxide. Methane's more lethal in that regard. But on the issue of leakage, right? The overall average is a 5 to 20% leakage.
Okay, let's talk about that. So what exactly is that? Is that some economic model?
No, that's just a study of what actually happens with carbon leakage.
Okay, I'd like to see that because can I please respond to that point? Because the only empirics we've actually seen and have actually been brought up in this debate is that after the EU imposed one of the most high-profile, notorious carbon taxes in the world, they did see, like you guys talk about with Finland, Sweden, Norway, etc., that they saw a domestic decrease, but overall they just pushed these emissions abroad and increased on net emissions 12%. Where in the EU? We also have another study that said they found leakage evidence in all 40 countries.
EU. How can it be like displaced to other countries which have a carbon tax? Like that's the argument I was saying. 82% of economists agree that if the United States implemented a carbon tax, nearby countries, nearby developed and developing countries would do the same thing.
Okay, so Russia is one of the biggest producers of oil, right?
All right, can I actually ask a question really quick?
Of course.
All right, can you guys guarantee that there's going to be like people going into there's like 8 seconds left, but I'll just ask this question really quick. How can you guys guarantee that people are going to be pushed into poverty when we are decreasing the long-term price of green energy?
Because what we show you is that that's not happening whatsoever. There's not going to be this shift to renewables. And remember where we show you not only that if we increase energy costs 110%, we're also going to have estimates that my partner's going to bring up that in the U.S. alone we can increase costs 35%, which he'll talk about.
You guys taking prep?
Yeah.
How much do you guys have left?
We took, I think, 40 seconds, was it? Or
Pretty sure like over a minute. I don't know.
over a minute? Oh.
Did you guys not time it the first time?
No, we did.
No, okay. I guess we have left. Okay.
I got 10 minutes, 50 seconds.
So 10 seconds.
Is everybody ready? Yes. Look at the Chaska State Public Forum rules. They specifically state that the affirmation cannot give a too detailed specific plan. They say you have to offer a plan of advocacy that is practical and general, because they knew that if the affirmation were to create a too specific and too tailored of a plan, it would be abusive, uneducational, and overall unhealthy to this overall debate. That's why we have to take a look at carbon tax in general. That's why the resolution phrases it that way. But now let's take a look at the responses they laid down to our case. Our first point was about economic harm, subpoint A, higher energy prices. few responses to this. The first one was that because renewable energy prices go down, people will actually end up spending less. There's a huge flaw with this. They're extrapolating their data from countries like Norway and Sweden, countries that differ from the United States, geopolitically, geographically, politically, and economically. Fundamentally, they're completely different from the United States. For example, look at their geographic location. They already have natural access to wind and geothermal energy. The United States, as diverse as it is, does not have that same capacity. We show you in our case that 85% of our energy comes from hydrocarbons. You can't magically have that 50% of energy somehow cover 100% of our energy needs. Even more importantly, take a look at our Australia evidence, where it shows that because it's reliant on coal and natural gas, just like the United States is, they found that when they passed a carbon tax, they lost 100,000 jobs and 10,000 businesses were bankrupted. Prefer that evidence to ours. And also look at modeling in the United States itself. We found that according to Forbes, if you increase the price of electricity by 35% through a carbon tax, you put 1.5 million Americans into poverty. Again, we show you that by passing a carbon tax, you're not going to access any of their economic benefits. Instead, you're going to see higher energy prices. Renewable energy prices staying the same, and the price of everything else rising. The average American cannot afford these things, and they're going to go into poverty. Now, let's take a look at their jobs point. They said that they're going to create jobs, but again, look at our empirics. In Britain, when they passed the carbon tax, for every job they created in renewable energies, they lost 3.7 elsewhere. In Italy, 2.2 jobs were lost for every renewable energy created by a carbon tax. Again, we have evidence on both sides showing that jobs are created, but we showed you modeling in both these countries that have carbon taxes, and again, in our own United States of America, you lose jobs, thus negate.
That was 20 seconds.
You guys ready?
Yeah.
So let's start with something funny about the summary speech. He starts by telling you we shouldn't be looking to the EU because it's not the United States, but then he goes on to compare the United States carbon tax that we're proposing to the UK and Australia. That's a contradiction. If they're saying we can't compare it to other countries, but then they come up here and read evidence about the UK, that's just a contradiction. You don't know where to look. But more importantly, they tell you that we're breaking tacit rules because we're talking about a revenue neutral tax policy. Two problems with that. One, a revenue neutral tax policy is empirically more probable than a non-revenue neutral tax policy. We give you 4 empirical evidence of revenue neutral tax policies around the world. They give you 1 example of a tax policy that is not revenue neutral. Based on probability, that's a 4 to 1 chance that the carbon tax that we pass is actually revenue neutral. But even more importantly, a plan requires timetable, funding, etc. We don't get any of that. Now let's go to the voting issues. The first is going to be green energy. They lose on this for a plethora of reasons. First, the evidence they keep citing is from 2006. We give you evidence from last month, which tells you that 1 gigawatt of solar or wind energy is $6 cheaper than the same gigawatt from natural gas. That means there is no switch from fossil fuels to natural gas. The switch goes from fossil fuels and natural gas to green energy. That's where you get all the impacts we talk about in our second argument. We see 3 to 4 additional jobs created for every 1 job created in natural gas. You see $263 billion created for investment in new technology. And you see 227,000 American lives being saved because of a reduction of carbon emissions. That is literally the biggest impact you hear in this round. If we're saving American lives, there is no other reason you need to vote for the affirmative. The second reason you're voting for us is on the economy. When we look at their evidence, either it doesn't exist or it's not talking about the United States. Their $21 trillion number is about a carbon tax on the entire world. Their 9.2 million number, they're doing math, they're not giving you an actual piece of evidence. Look to the reliable evidence in this round, which comes from our side. We show you that $1.3 trillion are added to the economy, $3 million are added, $800 is added to household income. The evidence you look to in this round is the evidence that's trustworthy, and that's the evidence that's coming from the affirmative. We're giving you up-to-date evidence that actually exists compared to their hypothetical non-existent evidence. Look to the affirmative in this debate.
So if renewable energy is so cheap in the status quo, why haven't we switched? And why is 85% of our country's energy still based on hydrocarbons?
Because there's not a carbon tax right now. Like, renewable energy is cheaper than natural gas, but because of subsidies on oil, it's not cheaper than coal and those other types of energies that are easily burned. So what we're telling you is that with the carbon tax, the cheap carbon that you can burn right now becomes more expensive and you switch to green
Okay,
technology.
we can show you evidence that it actually is, I think, similar in the same card possibly, that it actually is cheaper than these other sources. But the reason why we haven't switched yet is because of the fact that there's no infrastructure in place for it. All of these companies are still reliant on oil, on natural gas, and on coal, and they can't just simply say, oh, we're going to switch to renewable energy, because even though it might be cheaper, it's still such a small part of the... Okay, but the problem is you can't just, like, completely increase and spread...
Wait, hold on. Why don't you listen to, like, the data that we've been telling you since the very first speech? We specifically told you from the University of UCSD, University of San Diego, they find that green innovation will be 50% higher in the next 15 years, and that like, fossil fuel innovation will decrease by 60%. Why isn't that trustworthy? Because that's not talking about Europe, that's not talking about a revenue neutral tax plan or any like loophole that you'll try to find to respond to this argument.
Okay.
This is projection of what's gonna happen in the US.
Okay, first off, the evidence ignores two key areas that we've consistently brought up in our case and our responses. First and foremost, like my partner just brought up a minute ago, the infrastructure does not exist. Yes, hypothetically, energy could be cheaper, but if you don't have the infrastructure, suddenly it costs much more money to actually get that energy. But second, take a look at the fact that when we take a look at experts' analysis, they say that because of the abundance of natural gas, we're not going to be able to switch to renewables because there's a cheap, viable alternative.
Let me respond to both of the things your partner just said. You said that we can't switch to energy because companies don't have the infrastructure. But you guys are the ones in your speech who say that if costs go up, companies are going to uproot their entire companies and move to other countries. Like if companies can't invest in infrastructure in the United States, why can they move to other countries like Mexico and create entirely new infrastructure there? Second, when you talk about like we can't make this switch right now because it's too expensive. Again, from 2015, it is $6 cheaper per megawatt of solar or wind energy than natural gas.
Again, the problem with that I pointed out in my speech that you didn't respond to is that it's regionally cheaper because in some regions.
Okay, that's not a different card than us or something. That's not.
Okay, well the card we found said that it is regionally cheaper. We can show you. Anyway, the reason is that there are a lot of solar farms, there are a lot of wind farms in a lot of areas in America, but not all across America, and it's simply not ready to have everyone switch over to renewables.
We invest $40 billion every year into green energy. We have the infrastructure. The thing is,
and look where it's taken us. We still haven't made the switch. And
I know, because right now people want to use carbon because right now that's cheaper. Like, remember, this debate we were having. Alright, I'll bring it up. It's fine.
I'm going to take the lens first.
At the end of the day, this debate is a debate between reality and fantasy. So with that, let's look to the first area of analysis, the first voting issue, which is going to be economics. Now they say we're increasing jobs, we're decreasing prices because we switched to renewables, and we're redistributing wealth. But remember where we show you, in Italy, in the United Kingdom, in Scotland, in Denmark, in all these countries that my partner brings up in his speech, you actually decrease the number of jobs. In the UK, for every one job you create in the renewable sector, you lose 3 jobs. And remember the analysis we provide for you because of this. The United States economy is incredibly reliant on these fuels. It's a giant job sector, and we can't simply just switch over magically at the snap of our fingers to renewable energy. That's simply not feasible, not what's going to happen in the real world. Remember where we point to you to over 20 experts who instead say that we're going to delay the implementation of renewable energy because what will happen in the real world is that because the United States has these giant reserves of natural energy, which are already ready for a massive increase in their usage, what will actually happen is that we'll switch to natural gas. Remember also that we show you not only in Australia did prices increase by 110%. Remember we show you that 35% price increase is expected in the United States. And remember, even though they say that we can't talk about our 9.2 million people pushed into poverty, even if we only accept the 35% number, we still push 1.5 million people into poverty. And remember that the World Health Organization says that this poverty is killing 80 times as many people as climate change. But next, let's move on to climate change, the environment. Remember, where they can't respond to the fact that we're not going to be able to tax this methane. We can't find it, and we can't tax it. And as a result, on net, we will see emissions increase 5%. But even without that point, we also proved to you that in the European Union, where a carbon tax was implemented on the largest scale, what happened is that they purchased goods from abroad instead of domestically, which increased carbon emissions. Many of their companies moved abroad, which increased carbon emissions. And on net, carbon emissions increased 12%. And remember, at the end of the day, if we're not only pushing people into poverty, but also exacerbating climate change, the negation wins today's debate.
Okay, I'll take the remaining 32 seconds.
It's time.
Alright, the judge is ready. Time, start. Now my opponents have come up and basically said that now it's just not going to be possible to invest into green energy. But remember, Ani and I aren't saying we're going to switch to green energy overnight. That's simply not possible. That's why we tell you projections over the next 10 to 15 years showing there will gradually be an investment into green energy. That's why by 2030, there's going to be 60% less fossil fuel innovation and 50% more green energy innovation. At that point, that we're telling you that there's a 17% decrease in green energy prices. You see two things. First, more companies are going to be willing to switch to green energy. And second, it's going to be cheaper for the consumer. Now, this does two main things to hurt their argument. First, because it's cheaper for the consumer, you don't see these 1.5 million people into poverty anymore because they're getting $800 in income every year, and they're also seeing a decrease in prices for the goods that they're buying. But second, the point in which we're telling you that the companies are going to invest in the green energy, that's why you're seeing that the Congressional Budget Office said that there's going to be an 8% decrease in emissions in the United States. This is huge because at the very end of his speech, he said if it increases poverty and increases global warming, then you should go for the neg. But I just proved how none of those things are true. We are decreasing poverty and decreasing global warming. But now let's get into the more specific voter issues, which is saving American lives. Remember, we specifically tell you from the Guardian, they just show an overall what a carbon tax effect would have on the United States. Forget all that's happening in Europe and this debate that's been going back and forth. In the United States, a carbon tax would save 227,000 American lives over the next 15 years. This is huge because they only talk about poverty and their link to poverty is shaky. In fact, their only link to poverty is people are going to be losing jobs. But remember, that's not true. They say 1.5 million jobs are lost. But remember, those are jobs lost in the fossil fuel industry. We're telling you those are getting replaced by green energy jobs, which also create 3 to 4 additional jobs. We've been repeating these key statistics over and over because they have failed to respond to them. Remember, at the end of the debate, we're showing you a benefit to the economic standing of Americans. We're showing you a benefit to the environment. And finally, and most importantly, we are saving American lives through a carbon tax. Thanks.